Everywhere you look today, the world feels more unstable, whether that's from climate pressure or economic strain or political tension.
But the biggest risks don't often show up where you expect them.
At Shaken Not Burned, we believe that sustainability literacy is a key tool in identifying where those risks and opportunities lie.
Our podcast explores how the decisions driving our economies, institutions, and industries are unfolding in practice.
Because the pressures shaping our future are often invisible.
Until they're not.
This is Shaken Not Burned.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Shaken Not Burned. I'm your host, Giulia Bottaro.
And I'm your co-host, Felicia Jackson.
This is the fourth and last episode in the mining arc. People who listen to us regularly have realized that we've changed things a little lately to focus from general topics in sustainability to more specific sectors to really delve deep into their challenges, opportunities, and where we are now.
One of the reasons we chose to take this route is because there's so much to learn in every sector. Sustainability is a baseline for a lot of decision making now, especially when you're looking to develop and grow. And what we want to do is delve specifically into sectors to see what's happening and to identify what we can learn more generally about how we need to change the way that we work.
As we go along with this episode, you will see that there is so much to take from the mining sector, even from people who are not working in this specific industry. So as a quick reminder of the first three episodes that we did in this arc, which are linked in the show notes, we started off with geopolitics of critical minerals with Olympia Pilch at Minefield Consulting. It was a very wide-ranging, exciting episode about what's driving international trade and actually what critical minerals are in the first place, demand drivers, supply dynamics, a lot of information really well explained in one slightly longer than usual episode. Then we moved to deep sea mining with Simon Holmstrom from Seas at Risk. So the point of this topic was to really talk about innovation. Is it always what we need? What are the consequences? What are the drivers? Who's behind it? And so on. And at a time when there is a huge race to critical minerals, which are the best ways really to get there? And then finally, the episode that came out last week was about communities. So the social side of things with JP Gladu at Mokwate. We talk about the relationship between mining projects and their neighbors through the lens of indigenous communities in Canada. We use this case study, if you will, to talk about something that applies to any sector, anywhere. If you want to build something, you need to have the social license to operate.
That actually brings up what I think is the core paradox and why we chose mining as the first sector we were going to look at, which is that we fundamentally have an issue where we are relying on critical minerals for the transition. And yet mining itself is incredibly contested in sustainability terms. We know that mining is environmentally damaging and huge parts of society are anti-extending it into areas of protected nature or the deep seas. But what it's talking about is the fact that we are the ones demanding those minerals. We need more of something that many of us are very uncomfortable with. So what we've actually found across the series of interviews is that what mining surfaces is how many of these issues are fundamental to the challenges we face. What are the trade-offs that we are prepared to make? What are we prepared to pay in order to have the materials that we require for the goals that we've set ourselves?
One thing that I mentioned in possibly every single episode of this series is that we don't think about mining. Dare I say, some people may regard mining as an industry of the past, but nearly every single object we touch is made of minerals that come from the earth. The microphone that I'm speaking into right now, the laptop that I'm speaking to you through, the devices that people are listening to us through, they all contain minerals. And this is why it's crucial that all of us, whatever the sector we're in, learn about it.
I also think it's really important that we understand that what this question is about how we can build a sustainable future using unsustainable practices, because that's where people have the problem. We need to look at not only how do we make mining more sustainable, but how do we actually look at the demand side of things? We have to think more widely about our interaction, as you say, with a particularly damaging sector.
Yeah, I suppose it's easy to try to envision a future where the polluting sectors don't exist. But the reality is that the society that we live in will need them to an extent. So the idea is to reduce this impact as much as possible.
What we've done is reviewed the interviews, looked at the mining sector, and we've identified basically 5 strategic sets of failures that I think are true across many, many different sectors. The first one is the logistics gap, which actually is about industrial dependence. The second is the trust gap, which means we have to pay attention not just to the communities that are affected by things like mining, but also to the legitimacy of how we actually operate business. The third is the quick fix fallacy, that belief that new technologies are going to be the solution, that we don't have to worry about the impact we're having because some kind of technological breakthrough is going to solve the problem for us. The fourth then comes as a direct follow-on from that, which is the innovation mismatch. How do we actually decide what is a speculative intervention and what's a practical innovation that actually gets us closer to our long-term goals? And then, of course, the final one is the capacity failure. What have we done within the systems that we have that means we may not necessarily have the capacity to reach the goals we have because of the way our systems work?
This episode isn't quite a recap of the previous episodes, which we invite you to listen to after this one. But it tries to really answer 2 main questions. So the first one is, how can we reconcile the fact that we need to transition to a cleaner, more sustainable economy? Doing so requires to scale one of the most environmentally intensive industries on Earth, which is mining. And then secondly, what does this arc, and talking about the challenges that I've just described, what does it tell us about the realities, trade-offs, and opportunities and tensions that are essentially shaping the future of industrial sustainability?
Because we actually have to recognize that the transition as we currently have it planned is materially intensive. And that means that a clean future is dependent on scaling a dirty industry. So we need to think about sustainability in a different way, not necessarily as simply eliminating impact, but actually about reconfiguring how we do what we do. It's recognizing that a green future doesn't mean impact-free, but it might mean we have to accept different trade-offs. The real question is not whether or not there is damage. We need to minimize that, yes, but to a certain extent, the systems that we have in place are going to continue to damage. So we need to understand how we manage it, how we minimize it, and where responsibility lies for taking that action.
This is quite a nice segue into the logistics gap and something that Olympia Pilch brought up in the geopolitics episode. She mentioned something called the cake paradox. China has been for decades now and continues to be with a significant margin the leader, the most dominant force across the entire supply chain of battery minerals. Battery minerals like lithium, nickel, copper, they're being used to make electric vehicles. So the paradox here is that Europe and North America, so overall the global north, want the EVs, they want the finished product. However, they have been outsourcing the upstream and midstream part of the supply chain, so the extracting of minerals and then the refining of minerals to then produce the batteries, to China. So the idea is the global north wants the cake, but it's not willing to have a dirty kitchen. This essentially speaks to the point that we were making before, which is we need to realize that the transition requires some level of environmental damage.
Another thing that brings up quite clearly is the historical offshoring of industrial capacity and capability. Because one of the things that's happened is that there has been a shift away from manufacturing and processing in a lot of the large industrialized economies which are so dependent on critical minerals. And that means that the dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics change. One of the ways in which we can see the impact of this geopolitical imbalance is what happened last year with China's export controls. So it actually introduced export controls on magnets, and that actually completely froze some import-dependent assembly lines. So what we have to recognize, and I think comes across with a lot of the US focus on reshoring manufacturing, is that without specialized refining facilities and processing facilities for critical minerals, even if we manage to get them out of the ground where we are, we don't really have the capacity to turn them into what we need.
This is a really interesting point, and I once again invite our listeners to listen to the episode on it because it's a very, very complex topic. And it speaks about the fact that China is the leader because it spent 2 decades experimenting and figuring out, because these materials are something that has been used more recently. So it's not like coal, where there are processes that have been tried and tested, they've been going on for 200 years or so. The point is that Europe hasn't really thought about it until now, when it's kind of an urgency to really get these products to power the energy transition. And essentially, it has separated the production side from the consumption side. And this is creating a huge imbalance globally.
Yeah, well, because what that boils down to is recognizing that while we may argue a lot about whether or not we have access to critical minerals, minerals in the ground aren't enough. Actually, refining and infrastructure are a critical part of the mining process when you look at industrial consumption. And that means we have to recognize that sustainability itself depends on industrial systems. We can't actually assess transition. We can't plan for transition effectively if we don't understand how things are actually made.
This connects nicely to the point that Simon was making in the episode on deep sea mining, is that the current processes are for minerals that are being extracted from earth, the good old mines that we all are aware of. But the minerals that are extracted from the bottom of the sea come in different ores. If we were to go ahead with this type of sourcing, we would have to come up with completely new ways of refining them. So again, it shows that sometimes what is being presented as a quick fix to an emergency or perceived emergency that there is now of dependence on China isn't actually that quick at all. Going back to the strategy gaps mentioned a bit earlier in the episode, this is again the quick fix and innovation mismatch that we were talking about in relation to deep sea mining.
Yeah, because if you think about it, if you're looking at the deep sea, it's an experimental industry, and that has high environmental risks and uncertain science. There's a widespread recognition of the fact that we just don't know that much about the deep sea. I heard someone say we know more about outer space than we know what's happening at the bottom of the oceans. The thing is, we don't really know what the impact of disturbing ecosystems at the bottom of the ocean is going to have. We don't have the science to explore it. And the industry is racing ahead in the same way we have these discussions about opening up protected forest for mining, or the Arctic, whatever it might be. And that honestly brings up an important question, which is that actually what we need to be focusing on in mining? Is deep sea mining just a distraction because we don't have to worry about improving what we're doing on land because we've got this entirely new area? You know, we can argue, well, we can deep sea mine. We don't have to be reliant on China. And this actually brings up to me this other really important issue, which is every decision we make has a trade-off, and we're not talking about them. What tends to happen is an innovation occurs and everyone gets really excited and runs with it to completely transform the way everything works without looking at the implications. So deep sea mining, fantastic, stops reliance on China. But what is it actually doing to the world around us? And honestly, we just don't know.
One interesting thing that Simon said in the episode is that the argument that a lot of Western governments say is we do this deep sea mining, we reduce reliance on China. Turns out that China is the country with more to gain from pushing forward with this industry. So sometimes these arguments for these innovations that we may need or not need can be slightly narrow-minded, can be very laser-focused on a certain objective while perhaps ignoring what the real context is. And something that comes to mind is the fact that we already have all the innovation we need to move forward with the energy transition. What is lacking is willingness to take risks, or even capital sometimes, even though, again, money is there. It's just being used in ways that perhaps are not conducive to the energy transition.
You talk about risk and people aren't willing to take risk. They are. But the risk they're willing to take has to fit into the system that currently exists. So does it fit with the expectations of asset managers? Does it fit with the expectations of capital investors? Because I think that connects. You mentioned this idea that we have the technology we need. Look at what's happening with land-based mining. It's been described as almost entering a surgical era, but that's because it uses automation and digital twins and virtual modeling to actually manage its impacts more precisely. Now, I know that that is not the same thing as making mining sustainable, but it is making it more sustainable. It is lowering the impact. And one of the things I found fascinating was discovering how closely the mining industry is actually engaging with questions about nature and impact, engaging closely with the TNFD, looking at increased transparency around what they're doing. Now, obviously not everybody and obviously not everywhere, but I think what the current perception of mining does is it leads us to think about these new frontiers as new and exciting and fundable, but while not really investing in the technologies that can improve mining as it already is, not having to chase new high-risk interventions that we don't know the consequences of.
Actually, there is another way of doing it, of sourcing the minerals that we need, which is recycling. Recycling is crucial, recycling is possible, the technologies are there. What is missing at the moment is the feedstock, because whilst we're all of us sitting on piles of e-waste at home, the real volumes that we need to produce then enough minerals to produce more batteries is spent batteries from electric vehicles, which will come very soon in the next 5 to 10 years. The first generations of EVs come to the end of their lives. And so it's extremely important that every country really works on creating infrastructure, supply chains, so that the materials can be kept circulating in the system as much as possible.
There is an element here, though, that I think we do have to touch on, which is that we know recycling is important, but we also know it's hard and it's expensive and the feedstock is difficult. So this brings me back to the need to understand the scale of the demand in energy transition versus what we can actually do. With what we have today, we can actually get no more than sort of 5% of the materials that we need. And even by the 2040s, it's going to be 10 to 15% of demand. It just underlines the fact that we're not really having mainstream conversations about the disconnect between where we want to be and how we're going to get there.
So far, we've spoken about challenges on the supply side, while really we can look at the demand side. We can just think about how are we addressing demand. For example, does every single person need an electric vehicle? Or maybe we can spend more money in public transportation. And on the topic of demand, talking about sustainable mining is very important because it's what the final consumer wants. We are increasingly seeing that, especially when it comes to electric vehicles, if you want to call your final product sustainable, then it needs to be made with green raw materials as well. And this brings up to one of the other important points that we wanted to cover today, which is about standards and legitimacy. So how do you prove that these minerals are sustainable? Well, there are some resources out there, some frameworks to gain a certification and prove that you are a sustainable miner. But are they legitimate enough? Do people trust them? What do they mean?
Well, I think there's an interesting point here because we know that there's pushback on polluting projects. We've seen in Serbia where Rio Tinto's mine got scrapped because there was so much environmental pressure. What we have at the moment is voluntary standards and voluntary frameworks like the TNFD or like the International Council on Mining and Minerals, Mining with Principles, or even the copper mark. And the copper mark itself covers 30% of the global copper market. It's seen as a passport to the EU market. The challenge we have is that the model of voluntary standards is under a lot of pressure. There's organisations like Global Witness, which are actually questioning whether or not those standards are sufficient to get to what we need to see.
The issue with this is that they're often industry-led. So if it's industry certifying itself, that's when it raises the question, is this real? Can we trust it? Is this just a nice piece of paper? One interesting organization that is trying to address this is IRMA, which is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which is actually led by 6 stakeholder groups. So industry is one of them, but then there are 5 other stakeholder groups, and they include communities or the final consumer, for example, that can veto proposals coming from one of the groups. And so I think this type of initiative is quite interesting for this challenge. But ultimately, this just suggests that we need governments to do this. Things need to be imposed from the legislative point of view. I don't think there is another way to address it.
And I think that's true, but that raises its own questions. So if we are saying there's this shift from voluntary standards towards mandatory standards, or that we're moving towards enforcement of more sustainable behaviour, the question is who defines those standards and who actually trusts them? I mean, we've already got that disconnect between industry and environmentalists, that lack of trust that these consistent standards are being all applied in the right way. But there's this problem that the rules are often being designed in one market and then being deployed in another. And all of the countries that are involved, they've got different legal systems, they've got different regulatory capacity, and of course they've all got different economic priorities. So then the challenge becomes, how do you actually apply consistent standards across borders without creating problems that governments don't like, which is friction in trade or limiting participation and therefore lowering the supply in the market? And I actually think this comes back again to where finance is quite important. So all of the risks around a project get assessed by insurers, by banks, by investors. The potential for legal exposure or reputational risk or supply chain disruption all plays into whether or not a project will be insured or financed. So that is a really good use of standards. You know, if it doesn't meet certain standards, it's not going to get invested. But what we're seeing is that despite the ongoing discussion about how hard the enforcement of rules around sustainability are going to be, there's a lot of argument at the national level all over the world about how you actually manage sustainability and, you know, are the rules too strict for companies to grow and all of this kind of stuff. But in the end, what we're seeing is growing understanding of the impact of climate change, increasing concern about the impact of nature, because these things aren't about abstract science. They're about, is it too hot to work in the city? Is food going to grow in the right way where we need it to? Will a mine that tears up a rare ecosystem create some unknown consequence further down the line? So the science is moving, the physics isn't changing, the politics may go around, but in the end, if you want to survive in the long term, you've got to actually move beyond standards that say, okay, we think this will work, to actually formalizing what is necessary for a project to be thought of as good. You know, these are the things, the standards where they are now are shaping which projects can be financed and which can't. But I do think we're moving more closely towards an enforcement framework.
What you said about we need to move from maybe more abstract concepts to what really makes a project work really links to the point of capacity and legitimacy. So talking about communities, referring to the episode from last week, we need to involve people. If you involve people, then you have the knowledge, the type of feedback that is essential for a successful project. So I spoke with JP in the interview from last week about how important it is to involve communities and support them as well. So support means providing tools, essentially provide them with knowledge, or maybe consultants, people who can help really understand what the project is about, what it means for the local ecosystems, and so on. And this works for mining, but it works for every single physical project that needs to be built somewhere. I mean, recently we've seen a lot of people protesting against data centers being built in their area because they're so water and energy intensive. And so when you design a project, you need to involve its neighbors immediately, because if you don't, then you design it, you propose it, maybe it does get approved from the local authorities, but then it still needs to go through a consultation phase. And so during this phase, you may receive feedback that then requires the design, so the first step, to be changed. So it can be a waste of money, a waste of time, a waste of effort. Maybe you've antagonized the people in the area because they feel they've been excluded, or they feel that something was imposed on them. So talking to people, creating relationships, fostering them, really having clear, effective communication starts from the very beginning.
Do you know where I think that's most interesting? Because it touches on reputation, it touches on engagement, it touches on consultation. And historically, I think that has been very much seen as one of the softer skills required for project management. It's something that comes after initial decisions are made. One of the things that JP was talking about is that in Canada, projects that have Indigenous equity are actually getting approvals up to 50% faster than those projects without it. So we're actually talking about something that has a direct impact on speed of approval, which will have an impact on financial appetite, which will have an impact on how welcome something is. What that means is projects face fewer delays and they've got access to more consistent capital. And I think that's because it actually just deals with one of the biggest risks in mining, which is protests and legal challenges and delays. So when communities are actually part of the project, the risk profile of the whole project changes. And I think we're seeing this in mining because it's the most visible, but I think it's actually something that every sector is going to have to learn.
The famous social license to operate, and you mentioned earlier Rio Tinto's project in Serbia, which is now completely archived.
I mentioned this idea that other industries are going to have to learn, but there's something else that I think provides a really clear message for what is going on, and that is the cost involved in the choices that we make.
In the episode with Olympia on geopolitics, we talk about the fact that we've already mentioned in the current episode, which is the West wants the cake, it wants the final product, and there's been a reindustrialization of wanting to then reshore all the polluting industries, all the factories that had been outsourced for a very long time. But this comes with a cost. It comes with a cost, it comes with political tension, it comes with people being upset because people want jobs, but factories these days are highly automatized. So then people may get a nice factory, but they may get way fewer jobs than there used to be 30 years ago.
There's another element of this, which is actually, again, the trade-off between long-term sustainability and climate goals and the cost of transition, because there is a reality that at the moment, the cost of sustainable materials may be higher than non-sustainable materials, in large part, obviously, because most business operations do not factor externalities into their cost of doing business. So the impact on nature, the use of water, all of these things aren't factored in. But the problem you have is people want to be greener, but they don't want to pay any more for it. And I think there's a real challenge here about how you address that problem. Do you subsidize? Well, that comes from the government. If it's going to an industry that people see as polluting, how does that work politically? Is policy being framed in a way that is showing a direction of travel that gets companies to want to invest in more sustainable solutions? And I think we need to actually surface these conversations much more generally and much more widely, because they're fundamental to the choices we make. There was a whole discussion after the invasion of Ukraine about how expensive electricity was. The gap between the energy demand and the energy supply that increased because of the lack of fuels coming out of Ukraine was roughly equivalent to the amount of renewable energy that had been committed to back in the noughties. Then policies changed, it didn't happen. So we've got all these issues around energy security and food security and national security. But these are long-term decisions, and politics and money are often about very short-term decisions. We have to have a conversation about that. It has to be part of the political and financial dynamic.
This also connects to the fact that we need to accept the energy transition won't be easy and it won't be comfortable. And it's okay. I mean, burning won't be comfortable either when the temperatures go crazy. And all the extreme weather events, they are not comfortable either. So ultimately, we need to ask the hard questions. We need to be willing to spend some money somewhere. And politicians need to be willing to make the hard decisions. Unfortunately, it's really down to them at this point.
I'm not sure I agree with you.
Really?
Because you are right. Individuals are not responsible for what is going on. And I think the idea that individuals are being made to have been made to feel responsible is one of the biggest cons the fossil fuel industry ever managed to come up with. But there is a difference we can make because politicians care about what the electorate care about. Now, most people, let's be honest, don't know anything about mining or climate and probably don't really care about it that much in comparison to concerns about affordability, cost of living, their real on-the-ground personal future. But if we can have the conversations about what that actually means, because you pay now to pay less later. You have to make hard choices. And I think individuals that signal to politicians that they are prepared to engage in this, that's where we do have leverage. It's where's your pension invested? What is it that you're buying? Are you eating meat? Not that you have to not do these things, but be conscious. Make choices that actually suggest that you think this is important. It may not be the be all and end all, but say there's a really clearly better sustainability solution here and a bad one here. That's much, much lower. That's much, much higher. Find something in the middle. We don't all have to do everything, but if we all contribute in a small way, I do think we can make a difference.
Yeah, when I talk about we need to accept that sustainable transition will be hard, I kind of mean it more from a legislative perspective. And I think this is where politicians are so important. Someone should, at high levels, needs to stand up and say, look, people, it's not going to be easy, but we need to do it. We are very used to convenience at this point. We buy something, the next day shows up at our door. We drive everywhere. We do what we want at all times. We can eat any food at any point of the year. And so this is when I'm talking about political willingness, is that we need to reduce this convenience somewhere. I think it needs to be made in a fair way. And it's a very complex topic, and I obviously don't have the solutions. But I think, I think we need to really change the perspective of people. Convenience is no longer the number one driver of our society, and this kind of especially needs to come from a political perspective.
But I think, again, I'm not entirely sure I agree, because I totally agree with the fact that politicians have to set the legislation. We have to have a direction of travel. But I also think that easy convenience that you're talking about is something that everyone is so used to that we need to start changing mindsets so that the challenging political choices can be made. Because I may decry politicians a lot, and I do, but they have really difficult choices right now. Every time anyone in the UK talks about net zero, they're attacked from all sides, mainstream media, other politicians, rivals. It's all about, it's going to cost this much. What we need to engage with is a better understanding of what things cost over what period of time, why we're making the choices that we are. There are wars, there's climate impacts, there's all these different things. And politicians have to make difficult choices in a polarized environment about what they're going to stick to, what they're going to promote, how they're going to survive. And that's why I think, we need politicians, but we need companies to do the right thing. We need people to get involved. You said we have to change the perspective. I just think it's more than politicians, because politicians themselves work within a closed system that has its own limits and boundaries and dynamics. And actually, it's that thing of, if everyone at different levels does a little bit, we start to shift what we think is normal, what we think is expected of our behavior and the way that we do things.
What I'm about to say is a slightly far-fetched link, but I think this is what the mining arc is about. Because it's hard, because it's very complex, because it's challenging the status quo. It's about looking at the realities of supply when we talk about geopolitics. It's about the limits of the alternatives and innovation when we talk about deep sea mining. And it's also about the condition to really deliver when we talk about communities. So yeah,
I think that's a great summation.
To sum up, we need minerals. We need to find a way to source them.
Well,
There's no way around it.
I think the thing here is that we know the world needs minerals, but we also know there's resistance to mining. So what we need to do is understand the details of it, whether it's supply realities or the limits of alternatives or the conditions of delivery from one country to another or from one refining processor to a factory, whatever it is. But we need to stop having that automatic, mining is bad, and actually talk about the realities of how decisions are made within industries, within sectors, the lessons we can learn from one sector to another, and the lessons we can learn for a wider understanding of actually how our society functions.
Thank you, Felicia. I think we can officially conclude the arc on mining. We hope that you all liked it. Send feedback. We're very happy to receive it. And we have many, many sectors that we will tackle next. So the new one is already next week. So stay tuned. We are on LinkedIn. We are on YouTube, on Instagram. We also have a newsletter. We're leaving all the links in the show notes. So once again, thank you for tuning in and see you next time.